Okay, so good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here and to meet all of you today. I'll give a brief talk this afternoon on comparative theology and specifically on the ritual turn in comparative theology, which has been a topic of great interest to me. I'm like the other speakers before me, I'm a comparative theologian, but I'm also an interreligious scholar, and interreligious scholars, they study what we call the dynamic interaction between people who orient around religion differently. So both people who belong to different religious traditions as well as people who would call themselves non-religious or secular or go by other names. And within the field of interreligious studies, I'm very interested to not only look at texts and how people come to understand one another across traditions by means of textual study. I think there's a lot of attention that has gone to that, but I'm also very interested in more what I would call the material and the ritual interaction between people who belong to different faith traditions or non-faith traditions. And that can go in various directions. I'm interested in the possibilities, but also the limits of what we call inter-ritual hospitality, the participation in rituals that belong to another tradition. Is that allowed? Is that possible? What are the limits? What are the possibilities and the chances? But I'm also interested in looking at new ritual expressions of interfaith relations. We see from time to time that in Europe especially, but also in the US, I would love to hear how that would be elsewhere, but that you will see that there's new rituals that emerge in a context of religious plurality, rituals that are aimed at celebrating together across traditions, but also rituals sometimes that allow people of different traditions to grieve together. For example, in the context of the COVID crisis, ritual was not possible, but in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, there was clearly a need to come together again and to work through what had happened, and this affected people that belong to so many different communities and different traditions. And so you would see in different societies in Europe that new rituals emerge to work through that sense of loss and pain and grief also together. So those are all aspects of what I would call research into interrituality or research into ritual participation in the context of interfaith encounters. What I was asked to talk about today is, and that's a little bit in line with the other topics, is to talk about comparative theology and to discuss the possibility of a ritual turn in comparative theology and what that would entail. So I will start to share my screen. I prepared a small PowerPoint presentation towards that end, and I'll start sharing my screen now. Hopefully that works out. Let me see. All right. It should work, I think, and I can still see you, which is kind of nice. Okay, so my talk will be on the ritual turn in comparative theology. I wrote quite a bit on this on several occasions, and I think Klaus sent you, I hope at least Klaus sent you the text that I will be talking about today, which I think is published in the Blackwell Companion to Comparative Theology. So I suggest that I take a step back before I look at the ritual turn in comparative theology. I will first start by giving a brief introduction to comparative theology. Most of you will be acquainted with this, but then at least you have a sense of where I'm coming from. So comparative theology, and perhaps it's important before we begin that, but I think that was the case for all four speakers. All four of us come from Catholic theology, so all four of us are Roman Catholic theologians. So a lot of the things that I will be saying, I'm saying that from the perspective of Roman Catholic tradition also. So I think that's important to realize that there's comparative theologians across traditions, belong to different traditions. There's also Protestant comparative theologians, of course. I have a sense, but that would be a topic for further research, that there's also something specific about the way comparative Catholic theologians do comparative theology, but that is a discussion for another occasion, I think. So comparative theology emerged in conversation with theology of religions, which is a theological discipline that emerged around the time of the Second Vatican Council, which was a large church meeting in the 1960s within the Roman Catholic Church. And theologies of religions is a specific field within what we call systematic theology that emerged in the aftermath, you could say, of the Second Vatican Council. And one of the topics that Second Vatican Council dealt with specifically was, of course, the encounter between the church and the different religious traditions, relating on the questions like how should the church relate to those of other faiths? How should the church enter into a dialogue and enter into more constructive and friendly relations with those of other faiths? That was an important question at the Second Vatican Council. And in the aftermath of that council, you see that a specific field within theology emerges, namely that of theologies of religions, which is the field that picks up on the question about the relationship between Christianity and other religions. And you see that within that field of theologies of religions, the question about the relationship between Christianity on the one hand and other religious traditions is really framed or approached from a Christian theological framework. And that is very important. So it's going to be Christian theological questions that are at the heart of this theological approach. So what you will see is within the literature, it's all questions about soteriology, for example. Can non-Christians be saved? And I'm putting it's very specifically in this terminology because that is the terminology that is proper to theologies of religions. It's really talking about Christians on the one hand and those of other faith. And in the beginning, very much the language that was used was the language of you have Christians and you have non-Christians. And the questions were framed very much from a Christian theological perspective, questions in terms of salvation. Is it possible for non-Christians to be saved? Can we say that God reveals God's self also in other faith traditions? And to what extent, for example, can we say that Christ is the unique and universal mediator of salvation for all people? These are just some of the questions that were picked up and dealt with within that field of theologies of religions. Now, I can imagine, I do not know that this kind of phrasing gives you a rather discomforting feeling, a sense of, that is very much an intra-Christian discussion. And indeed, that is very much the case. And that is precisely what comparative theologians are going to criticize also. Now, within that field of theologies of religions, you're going to see a very intense debate emerge, an intense debate between the so-called exclusivists, the inclusivists, and the pluralists. And I'm giving you this because if you want to read up also within the field of comparative theology, this is going to be a discussion that you also encounter time and again. And so to put it very briefly, you had exclusivists who said, well, non-Christians, no, they cannot be saved. They cannot be saved unless or you can only be saved when you have faith in Christ. So for non-Christians, salvation is not a possibility. Inclusivists, which is to this day also the official position of the Roman Catholic Church, would rather say, well, salvation is a universal gift from God, but Christ is always somehow involved in that plan of God's salvation. But explicit belief is not necessary for salvation. And then you have pluralists who would say, well, I would say that the different religions are historically, culturally determined expressions of one ultimate reality, and that you could say that they all form different paths to salvation and are more or less equal in the sense of salvivically equal. They give equal access to salvation. But this was like an ongoing discussion between exclusivists, inclusivists, and pluralists, with pluralists saying that exclusivists and inclusivists were incapable of openness for those of other faith, and inclusivists and exclusivists saying to pluralists, for example, you are giving away the heart and the particularity of other religious traditions. But increasingly, you could see that towards the end of the 20th century, that there were concerns amongst theologians, certainly those theologians that were involved very much in interreligious dialogue, so people who were actually speaking and encountering those of other faith, whether this theology of religions was really the right discussion. Is this really the way that we should be theologizing about religious diversity? Are these the questions that we should be asking? And there was a certain discomfort about the way Christians were setting the agenda for the discussion. It's Christian questions about salvation, about revelation, about Christology, with different Christian responses. But this is really an intra-Christian debate. And so to what extent can we say that theologies of religions is really doing also justice to the self-understanding of those of other faith? It's really a discussion that goes to the heart of Christian tradition, but it's not really learning us a lot about those of other faith. Yeah, so rather than being an interreligious dialogue or enabling an interreligious dialogue, we are dealing with an intra-Christian dialogue. And that came also, or that went hand in hand with a concern that theology of religions was adding again to what we call the Christianization of other traditions, really forcing other traditions to contribute to a discussion that did not concern them at all. And forcing them into a shape or a form or mold that is not fitting their own self-understanding. And that is what we call Christianization in this sense. According to Clooney, whom I think you've met a couple of weeks ago, one of the concerns also of this theology of religions debate is that there's a tendency to pay a lot of attention to the nuance and the theological complexity of Christian tradition and the theological arguments that are unfolding within Christian tradition, but then to speak in very generalized ways about other traditions. It doesn't really, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it didn't seem to matter that much whether you developed the theology of religions pertaining to Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus. It was really Christians vis-a-vis non-Christians, and with a lot of attention to the detailed, nuanced theological subtleties on the side of Christianity, but that was not matched with a detailed appreciation for the subtleties of the theological traditions of non-Christian traditions. And that unevenness, it was not a good starting point. And so from those questions, critiques, sensitivities, you would see that towards the end of the 20th century, someone like Clooney, also someone like Fredericks, for example, and then later also Clooney and Cornell, and then even a bit later myself, we really are dealing with generations here, started to argue for a different approach, moving away from theologies of religions and that intra-Christian debate towards more a theology that is really invested in learning across traditions. And so we see a shift from those intra-Christian discussions to more a kind of an inter-religious theology. I know, and Miriam might say a bit more, and Leah too, in the context of Germany, for example, comparative theology is sometimes also called inter-religious theology, as a way to emphasize precisely that it's not theologizing about other religious traditions, but it's really theologizing starting from different religious traditions and learning across traditions. And so here in comparative theology, the idea is very much that the focus will be to pay attention to the complex theological and philosophical reasonings, not only developed by Christians, but also the way theological reasonings are developed in other traditions. And usually comparative theologians, precisely because they really want to go deep and delve deeply and go beyond generalizations, they focus only on one other tradition than their own. So you will often see that someone like Clooney, he is specialized in Christian Hindu comparative theology. Klaus von Stoß is specialized in Muslim Christian comparative theology, as Joshua Ralston, for example, also Muslim Christian theology. And I'm more interested in, or more specialized, you could say, in Jewish Christian comparative theology. So it's precisely because it's really going into deep in the depth of different traditions that they are also much more limited than those more generalized approaches of theologies of religions. And so the idea is that by moving back and forth between two traditions, comparing two traditions, going into deep, new questions will emerge, new insights will emerge, new perspectives. So rather than starting from Christian questions and looking for Christian answers, here the idea is more, okay, let's study across traditions and what new insights, what new questions might emerge, questions that perhaps Christians have never asked themselves, and what new perspective comes from that. So the starting point for comparative theology is very much what I would call hermeneutical openness. And hermeneutics always has to do with everything of understanding, interpretation. Yeah. And so hermeneutical openness is that openness, that willingness to understand other traditions in their own specificity, in their own particularity. And so to avoid, and there's not a, I always say there's not a good English word for this, there's also not a good Dutch word for that, that to avoid Hineininterpretierung. It's a German word that is actually alluding to that tendency, I would say, a very human tendency to project your own assumptions, your own prejudices, your own questions onto the other. And comparative theologians are going to try, by starting from a posture and attitude of hermeneutical openness, to avoid that kind of Hineininterpretering, to avoid their own questions, their own biases, their own prejudices onto those of other faith. And they will do that by really paying attention to the structure, to the questions, to the details of other traditions. With a posture of openness, and I sometimes also use the word a posture of vulnerability. Why do I speak about vulnerability? Because it gives you a sense of, as a comparative theologian, your willingness, your preparedness, sometimes also in ways that you do not expect, to be touched by other theological traditions, to be impacted, to be changed, to be transformed by other traditions. Yeah. An attitude of vulnerability is, of course, contrasted with an attitude of control, where you already know all of the answers beforehand. Do you understand? So comparative theology is very much a theological enterprise. So it's not just comparative religion. It's very much a theological enterprise, because the assumption is that by opening up to traditions of those of other faith, that you can also gain a deeper insight or a deeper understanding of your own tradition, and some will say gain a more profound understanding of God. And that is why sometimes comparative theology is also compared to interreligious hospitality. And I know both in Christianity, in Judaism, as well as in Islam, the virtue of hospitality is so important. And the virtue of hospitality is not just an ethical virtue, in the sense of you should welcome the stranger and you should take care of the stranger and really go out of your depth to take care of the stranger, but it's very much also a theological virtue, because by welcoming the stranger, you also welcome God. And in encountering the stranger, you can also encounter God. And in taking care of the stranger, you also take care of God. And so sometimes comparative theologians will compare their work to that attitude of interreligious hospitality, saying that when we welcome theological traditions that are not our own, when we welcome strange theological traditions, perhaps we will welcome God in a new way again also. Yeah. So comparative theology usually operates via the study of religious texts, and the terminology that is sometimes used in that context is that of intertexting, or of cross-reading or back and forth reading. So you can really imagine comparative theology having on their screen texts from two different traditions and really reading back and forth on a specific topic. Consider, for example, the topic of salvation, or the topic of hope, or the topic of anger, or the topic of creation. Those are all topics that one can look at as a comparative theologian. And then you select specific texts from two different traditions that have something to say about the topic that you would like to discuss. And you're going to really look back and forth and see what new perspective, what new angles emerge. Usually comparative theologians in their intertextual work, in their textual reading, they will focus on theological texts, texts from important theologians. They might also look at mystical texts. Sometimes they look at philosophical texts, and many of the traditions that we look at do not only have a theological tradition, but they also have a philosophical tradition. And sometimes, and that is something that I always like doing, is looking at scriptural texts together with their commentaries. Yeah, so how are certain texts also read differently in different traditions? Yeah, how are they commented on differently in different traditions? So, for example, one of the things that I did in my research is look at the figure of the suffering servant, who figures in the First Testament, but plays a very different role in Jewish imagination as compared to Christian imagination. And so what can we learn from Jewish scholars who also attend to that figure of the suffering servant? And how can we perceive our own reading differently through the eyes of Jewish scholars? Yeah. Sometimes comparative theologians will say that they approach the different texts from different traditions not only with scholarly diligence, so they bring different methods of textual analysis to the text. Some will use historical critical analysis or literary analysis, or Redaktionsgeschichte, and so on and so forth. But some comparative theologians will also say, well, this is very much a theological stance, so there's also a certain spiritual dimension to reading texts across traditions. Now, an important question does emerge when we look at comparative theology, and I think it's important to realize that, again, go back to that discussion between comparative theology and theologies of religions. The major concern when comparative theology emerged was, how do we avoid Christianizing other faith traditions? How do we avoid shaping other traditions again in the image of Christian tradition? Yeah? How do we attend to the specificity of different traditions? So this was very much a question about, how do we understand across traditions? How do we create a posture of hermeneutical openness? And that was a key question in comparative theology. And that is going to play also a very important role when we now turn to the question of why comparative theologians focus on texts. Yeah, and whether they should focus on texts, because that hermeneutical question plays an important role in that. Now, we see that comparative theologians, I explained, it's very much intertextuality or cross-reading. Why do they focus on text? Well, many people will say it's obvious, to focus on texts, because texts are at the heart of the so-called world religions. World religions are textual religions. They are religions that have texts and that have transmitted their tradition via texts, whether they be scriptural texts, or also the commentaries, the theological texts, philosophical texts. That is where you find the key doctrines, the key beliefs, the heart of a tradition. That is the source, that is the cornerstone to which we always go back. Some will say texts also form the stable resource to understand other traditions. Maybe a lot of practices change under the influence of culture and so on and so forth, but the texts, they form the stable basis of the different religious traditions. Another reason is why comparative theologians focus on texts is because, well, when we look at theology and theological reasoning, we find theology and theological reasonings in a textual forms. In a textual form. And so if we want to gain access to the very subtle way of reasoning, to the very subtle theological arguments of different traditions, that is where we will be looking at. We will find them by reading texts, by reading commentaries, by looking at theological arguments in a textual form. And certainly when we want to have access precisely to the nuance and the subtleties of traditions, to avoid what some call essentialization, we need to attend to those different theological texts of different traditions. It's a way to avoid also some kind of a doctrinal fixation. I'll explain. Imagine that you would say, I'm just going to compare doctrines about creation, about God, about the nature of God, for example. If you only focus on certain propositional statements, there might be the risk that you fixate the meaning of traditions based just on those doctrines, based just on those statements, but you do not have access then to the very different ways theologians throughout history have dealt with these doctrines, have interpreted it, given this new, nuanced, subtle interpretations. And so in comparative theology, remember, we don't want to speak in a generalistic way about different traditions. We want to attend to the nuances. So you will look at theological texts for the nuances. Now, this focus on text is both classical and novel. It's very new, you can say, that we're going to focus on reading texts across different faith traditions. Usually theologians, Christian theologians, Muslim theologians, Jewish theologians, and so on and so forth, they'll just focus on reading texts from their own tradition. They're not going to focus on reading texts from different traditions. So in this sense, comparative theology is very new. It's doing something that few people have done in earlier times. And it's also one of the few practices where you see a reading across traditions. The only exception I know of is also the practice of scriptural reasoning, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians read each other's scriptures. But at the same time, it's a very classical approach to theology, because in most theological traditions, whether they be Islamic or Jewish or Christian or Hindu and so forth, the focus has always been on texts. So comparative theology, it crosses boundaries by doing this in an interreligious way, but at the same time, it's very classical because it's doing theology the way theology has always been done, focusing on reading texts. Now, it is striking in all of this that comparative theologians that are really looking at the nuance in the different traditions are not all that interested in the ritual dimension of religion. And this raises two questions. So you can see it's really this textual fixation, this textual focus, but there's really not that much interest in symbolic practices, in symbols, in what people do, in how they ritualize their life. And this raises, according to me, two very important questions. First, how does the neglect of ritual affect comparative theology in its hermeneutical openness? Remember, comparative theology really wants to do justice to the nuance, the particularity of different religious traditions. Is that even possible when the focus is limited to looking at texts, knowing that in religion rituals plays such an important role? So hermeneutically, are we able to really reach deeply to gain understanding across traditions when we limit ourselves to texts? Secondly, how does that affect the theological task of discernment? Comparative theology is not just comparative religion, it's really also about gaining a deeper understanding of God. And so to what extent is that possible when, again, that limitation is made textually? At the end of the day, two questions we have to ask: are religious traditions most authentically represented by texts? And are religious texts the primary locus for doing theology? And that's what I'm going to attend to now. So comparative theology has, due to its textual focus, has had a rather limited scope. And this may also be a hindrance, I would say, to understanding another religion in all of its complexity. Yeah? Because the focus of comparative theology, because it focuses on texts, is also focused on the human being in terms of a rational being. It focuses mainly on knowledge production via the mind, via reason. Yeah? But religion, and that also goes for the human being, is specific because of its capacity to symbolize and to ritualize. Yeah? What is religious is not only textual. Religion really revolves also around practices, around doing, around embodied movements, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and so that is really not captured when we only focus on the texts. Yeah, so here's a quotation. Yeah, ritual is an act. It's a doing. It's performative, true and true. Consider in this regard the breaking the bread and drinking from the wine, making the sign of the cross, touching the relics of a saint, kneeling before an altar, lighting candles, embarking on a pilgrimage, reading from the Torah scrolls, eating matzah and bitter herbs during Passover meal, singing psalms, offering food and water to a deity during worship, sitting in zazen, chanting in a Buddhist temple. And those ritual performances, they engage not just the mind, but they engage the entire body, the whole person, as a social, imaginative, emotional, and embodied mind. It's the person in terms of a body that is engaged in ritual, and they impact all the senses. Yeah, the smell and the sight, and so on and so forth. Yeah? And importantly, in this regard, is that the rituals are quite often the primary source of knowledge. Yeah, so it's through ritual participation that people within their tradition gain access to religious knowledge, to know what is true, to know how to behave, to know what is appropriate. You learn that through praying, through going through certain motions, to engaging in ritual practices, individually, but also very much importantly in a community. Yeah? And through ritual participation, through participating in the rituals of your community, you gain a deep knowledge, a knowledge that precedes the knowledge through the mind that is also discussed in theology. Yeah, it's a knowledge that is attached to your body, and that knowledge, that deep knowledge, cannot be reached just by reading texts. I know a lot of people who have read a lot of religious texts about Christianity, for example, but they don't have that deep sense about the truth of Christianity. And the same goes for Islam, because you don't get to know God only through your mind, but also through your embodied engagement. Yeah, and so to access those deeper layers of knowledge, yeah, the question arises, yeah, if we want to access those deep layers of knowledge also of other traditions, does that mean that we have to do what others do? Does that mean that we have to move from intertextuality to interrituality? Now, that religion is practiced by ordinary believers, and that it revolves around embodied symbolic practices, and that ordinary believers or practitioners gain a deep knowledge through engaging in rituals, does not necessarily mean that theologians should also study across traditions via ritual. You could argue, for example, that theology is very much a rational practice, a practice of the mind, and that this is something very different from just gaining deep knowledge via your body. No, theology is something about the mind, so it makes sense to focus on texts, correct? This assumption that theology should focus mainly on texts is also challenged by liturgical theologians. So there's a group of people, the liturgical theologians within Christian tradition, that say, oh, it's not very much true that texts are the primary source of theology. They say that theology actually emerges deep insight into God, and theology emerges actually, or the first source of theology is actually liturgy. It's actually in celebrating together, in praying together, that people discern God. And doctrines within Christian tradition, they did not emerge just from textual study, but they actually emerged from a context of liturgy. And so starting from that understanding, and I can't go into depth here because we don't have enough time, but starting from that understanding, liturgical theologians say that theology should look at liturgy and ritual and symbolic practices as the primary source of doing theology. Yeah, because theological insights, they develop while celebrating. Yeah, and those insights may alter and transform the correct the church's theologizing about tradition. So to discern the truth, liturgy should be considered too. So, and if you take that argument of liturgical theologians seriously, and you apply it also to other religious traditions, yeah, that would mean that comparative theology, to gain deep understanding across traditions, should also attend to rituals and to liturgy, and should perhaps move or complement intertextual reading with interritual reading. Does that make sense? Now, of course, I can explain this here, but there's a lot of problems also involved with such a shift from texts to rituals, even when you complement both. And I will just say a couple of those before wrapping up. Is that okay? So there's going to be hermeneutical problems, so problems that have to deal with that have to do with, with understanding across traditions. There's going to be methodological problems. How are we going to do this? There's going to be ethical problems, and there's going to be theological problems. Yeah, and I think it's important that we also consider those, and perhaps we can make them a topic of our conversation in a minute. So first, hermeneutical problems. So remember what I started with. Comparative theology is a critique of theologies of religions. Theologies of religions, they revolve around an intra-Christian discussion, asking Christian questions with Christian responses, but really not listening to the specificity and particularity of other traditions. And so comparative theologians say one should start from a posture of hermeneutical openness, so as to avoid hineininterpreteren, as to avoid projecting your own images onto other traditions. Now, the ritual turn, actually also links with this hermeneutical openness, because the real question is, how do we gain access? How do we come to understand other faith traditions? How do we do justice to the particularity of other faith traditions? And so the ritual turn starts from the idea, if you want to gain deep knowledge, you should not only attend to texts, but you should go to the primary knowledge as it is produced in religious traditions. And that primary knowledge comes via ritual. So if we want to attend to that deep layer of knowledge, we should also bring in ritual. Now, the biggest problem here, or first hermeneutical problem, is that the meaning of rituals is not stable. I'm not saying that the meaning of text is stable. That is, again, another discussion we can also have, but the meaning of rituals is quite often not stable. There is a discrepancy between the official meaning of rituals, what prayer means, in a Christian tradition, what the Eucharist means, for example. There's the official meaning. We can all say that. That's not so difficult. But when you would ask people, Christians, for example, who leave Mass, or Catholics who leave the Eucharist, what has this service meant to you? Why was this important? Why do you participate? How did you give meaning to the service? And so on and so forth. You would get different responses. Does that make sense? So not everyone who participates in the same ritual gives the same meaning to that ritual. So the question is, if you participate in a ritual, what meaning are you actually accessing? And to what extent is this going to help you understand that deeper layer of knowledge? What is the precise epistemic value of these experiences? And also, if, for example, I would be participating in Shabbat, am I then experiencing Shabbat as a Jewish participant or as Marianne Moyaert, the Catholic who is doing Shabbat? So what is it precisely that I'm accessing? You could also say, of course, how is this different from when we are reading texts across traditions? If I'm reading a text from Talmud, am I accessing the meaning from a Jewish perspective, or am I accessing the meaning through my own eyes? So these are also problems, of course. Secondly, there are methodological problems. And I think this is something that Professor Clooney often alludes to. And he says, well, there is a sense also in which reading texts from different traditions is just methodologically a little bit I wouldn't say easier, because you have to know the languages and it's very demanding, but the texts are at least accessible. And nowadays, quite often, a lot of these texts are also translated. So even if a translation is not the same as reading them in the original language, at least a text you can read at home from your own desk, and it's kind of accessible. Nobody can people can say that you are not allowed to read their texts, but they are very much publicly available nowadays. That is not the case with rituals. We see that different religious traditions, we can see that as kind of concentric circles. Some rituals are very much open to welcoming outsiders and to welcome them to participate. But there are also rituals that go to the heart of a tradition where outsiders would simply not be welcome. If I'm speaking from my own tradition, for example, from Catholic tradition, you can participate in as an outsider, be present during Mass. Listening to the service of the word is not a problem, but you would not be welcomed to participate at the Eucharist. That is simply not acceptable in most Roman Catholic services. So there's that methodological problem also, that there are boundaries, ritual boundaries that are established. And of course, comparative theologians, if the whole point is to also be respectful to other traditions, respecting the boundaries between different traditions will also be important for comparative theologians. But that will also mean that you do not always have access to this. And then there's the ethical problem. I call this an ethical problem in the sense that in comparative theology, just as in interreligious dialogue, I think authenticity is a very important aspect. That you remain faithful to your own tradition, but that you also try to be respectful to the tradition of the other, and that you do not pretend to be someone that you are not. Does that make sense? And so in a context of dialogue, that is very important, and for comparative theology, that is also the case. Now, if you think about ritual, this presents a couple of problems because in the case of rituals, rituals are often quite public. They are public performances. Everybody can see that you are participating, and also people can see, probably, that you are an outsider participating in the ritual of a tradition that is not your tradition. Okay? Now, this presents two problems. On the one hand, it can conflict with your own authenticity. It can conflict with your own faith commitment. Because when you participate in the ritual of another tradition, are you then still being loyal to your own faith tradition? Are you somehow trespassing your ritual obligations towards God, for example? Are you performing rituals that are in conflict with your own tradition? Yeah, that is an important question to ask. But also the question is, when you participate in those rituals, but you do not really believe in those rituals, you do not share at least the official meaning of those rituals, are you then pretending to do something that you don't believe? Is it a form of false pretense? Is it a form of play? Is it a form of make-believe? And is that very respectful to the tradition of those others? Do you understand? Is it a way of pretending to be something that you're not? I think that is also a concern. And I think the final concern here is also to what extent. But perhaps you can also ask that question when you're dealing with texts. Yeah? To what extent are you using the rituals of others to gain a deeper knowledge, to feed your theological imagination? Yeah? Is that ethically okay? Should there be a certain proportionality in what kind of knowledge you are trying to gain? And then finally, there's of course also theological problems, and that is how, when you participate in the rituals of others, will you discern and also theologize about the question whether God does or does not speak through those other rituals? Yeah, perhaps, and that is sometimes a question that comparative theologians and interreligious theologians do not want to hear. Perhaps God really just doesn't like us participating in the rituals of other traditions. Yeah, perhaps that's a possibility, and have we considered that possibility? So, of course, it's always nicer to end with all possibilities and opportunities, but I think being very clear also both of the opportunities, but also mentioning some of the difficulties in such a ritual turn in comparative theology may open up so the further discussion. And I hope I've kind of remained within the time, Abdul. So I'm just going to see if I can stop share the screen. Yeah.